Hello everyone and welcome back. This is the fifth panel today on day one of W.A.S.D. Today we're talking about sustainability. Can the game industry keep growing without ruining the planet? Slight change of plan to how we were going to run this panel. One of the members, Jess Rutland, couldn't make it today because she tested positive for COVID. We hope she stays safe and that she enjoys watching the stream from home. But it is my very great pleasure to introduce Dr. Tomas Rawlings from Auroch Digital, who's going to talk to us about sustainability in the games industry.
Thank you. And yeah, hopefully my colleague Jess, hopefully they are watching, and hi Jess, hope you feel better. So this is a talk that I hope will be interesting, I hope won't be too depressing, and I hope will be illuminating. And it's a really difficult topic because it's a serious topic, and in all honesty, every media outlet should really be blaring this message 24/7. And the question is, why are we not? And I think it's going to relate a little to what I talk about later, so it'll seem slightly rambling at the moment, but you'll see where I'm going with it. It's because the threat we face with climate change is almost uniquely designed to bypass the systems we humans developed to protect ourselves. So, and this is where being a games developer, creating content comes in, is if we've got a game and we want an enemy, a baddie in the game, well, we give them a face. We make them threatening. We give them maybe horns. We make them spiky and scary looking. We give them a horrible voice. We make them do, you can introduce them by a cutscene where they come in and do something horrible. You can immediately set the scene for that enemy to say, this is a bad person. You need to oppose this person. We need to stop this person. By contrast, climate change is invisible. It's not immediate, as in, it's not charging at us now. It's not a fire in the room. It's not somebody running at you with a stick. It's everybody. It's everything we do. So our systems to protect ourselves, developed on the savannas of Africa 200 to 450,000 years ago, designed to protect us against predators and threats that we could see, that were immediate, that we can understand. And now we face this one that is the opposites of all of those. And I think there's something as game developers we can do to help, but you'll see where I go with that. So the big question is, can the games industry keep growing without destroying the planet? And I could take that apart and what I mean by keep growing, and there's a whole debate about growth, whether or not it's sustainable, everything like that. But at the core of it is, while we do face this existential issue, we still have lives. We still have to make a living. We still have to be entertained. We can't, even though the threat is there 24/7, by the same token, we can't live ourselves in a 24/7 state of fear. Therefore, all those normal functions that human beings do, including play, still persist. They're not going to go anywhere. They're not going to disappear in the nature of this threat. So, in a way, it's a question we have to ask ourselves whether we want to or not. And the fact that there will be a games industry, whether we want there to be or not, and there will be play, most importantly, whether we want there to be or not, because human beings, just like perceiving the threat of climate change is difficult, play is also intrinsic, not just to humans actually, to mammals. Play is an intrinsic behavior we can't avoid. So before I get into the more bits, I'll just introduce ourselves. So we're a Bristol-based studio, founded just over 10 years ago. We're part of the Sumo group now, which will relate a little to what we do. And we've been in the lucky position that a lot of the titles we've made are things that we're really interested in. So I personally am fascinated by science. I love science. I'm really into it. And so naturally, I then get interested in climate change from a number of angles. The physics of what happens with it, the technologies we might develop to mitigate against it, the psychology of what it means and how we understand it. And all those, to me, relate then about how we do things, how we make things there. So even we became part of Sumo, this was one of our, so we have a series of values as a company. You don't have to have values as a company. I could do a talk about what you should or shouldn't do as a company. But I think you should have values, because if your value as a company is to make money, it's not massively inspiring. And it's also, again, as human beings, we're more complicated than that is the only thing. Sure, We need to make money because we've got bills to pay. We want to buy nice things and all that sort of stuff. But equally, as human beings, we also want a sense of something bigger than ourselves. And I think if you, as an organization, you have values that are beyond just let's make money, that's helpful. And when you're a games developer, actually you have a value beyond just make money, which is make people enjoy playing your games. And that's a harder thing. If we manufactured, say, toilet roll, and there's nothing wrong with that, we all need it, you could be fairly predictable about what's happened with that. When you're making games, by its nature, it's quite unpredictable. So we can make a game, we can have all the features we felt that game should have, and then at the end of it, look at it and go, it's still not fun. That intangible, very human sense, very mammal sense of something can be missing. And therefore, I think you do need to have values that go above beyond it. So for us, we felt we can't really ignore the climate as an issue, and climate and social justice, social sustainability, they interlock with each other because they're part of the same set of issues. Once you start unpicking them, you can't unpick one of these big issues without running across the other. And so, at the very minimum, I thought, it would be nice if we didn't make the situation worse. At best, could we help? And so that's the value we tried to do about it. And there's two main areas we can do that in. One is what we talk about, what we make games about. As creatives, and this goes back to my original thing about trying to explain this thing to an audience. And then the social sustainability, how we operate as a business, how we interact with people, how we, the services we use, the resources, everything like that. So there's two kind of areas we can really touch on there. So sustainability, again, is a massive topic. I'm not an expert, but ultimately, we grab this chart that sort of illustrates the various interlocking parts to it. But I think, again, to me, sustainability is the idea that we're trying to have a sense that what we do can be carried on, that it's not so rapacious that we end up stopping our ability to do it. So, give an example of, in a way, sustainability is easier to define when you see the opposite. So, if you've ever read Jared Diamond's, he's written a bunch of books, but one of his books explores Easter Island. This one I remember because I used to have a mystery book as a kid, The Mystery of Easter Island. They have these huge stone heads they built, they're massive, they're really complicated. Yet on the island, when they arrived there, there wasn't, the people that lived there then didn't have the tools to make those. There was none of the materials they needed to make it. How did they get there? And the books, it's like maybe it's aliens, maybe like Atlantean civilization. It turns out it's a question of sustainability. The civilization that was there cut down all the trees, couldn't build boats, couldn't go fishing, and they spent all their trees trying to build massive statues, ended up wiping themselves out, and a new civilization or new peoples replaced that. And I'm simplifying a very complex history there, just for the sake of it. But it illustrates, you can see it when it doesn't work. It's really apparent where it doesn't work. And the big question we face with climate is, do we want to be one of those civilizations that other peoples root through the ruins of? And go, well, how did they get there? How did their hubris bring them to this point? How did their inability to sustain themselves bring them to this point? And again, I think for me, so many games make on the topic of post-apocalyptic, and we'll cover one of ours that did do this. And post-apocalyptic and dystopian futures are by their nature interesting things to talk about because they're different from what we have now, and we're able to explore questions we can't. But one of the games we made, we worked with some scientists from the Wellcome Trust, and we started thinking about what would a climate breakdown look like. And I think a lot of people, they think Mad Max, it's great, I'll get to wear these cool outfits, and we'll drive around, and there will no one telling us what to do, and it'll all be fantastic. But I thought a lot about, okay, if the systems that we use for the way we live now break down, when you start to think about the things that go, it's actually quite frightening. So there's no sewage system. So you've got all your great Mad Max outfit, and you've prepared tons of food. It's not long before you're swimming in your own filth. And then you cut yourself, you get a small cut, there's filth everywhere, there's no antibiotics. It's lethal. The reason why the number of people who died, say, early life, childbirth, and of very preventable diseases not that long ago is because we didn't have any of that tech. Dentistry. Imagine a life without dentistry. A toothache, something really basic like an infection in your gum. would be debilitatingly painful for weeks, if not months. Some of the stuff could be years of debilitating pain. When you start to think about without those systems, it's a terrifying thought. So when you think about post-apocalyptic and let's prep for the apocalypse, the best way, by a long way, is not to have it. That is the best prepping. So again, we start thinking about what that means. So for me then, climate change, as say the two areas, and talk to the first one, is, well, let's start thinking about it as a topic we can talk about. We can talk honestly and openly about it. And this is a screenshot from a game we did called Dark Future Blood Red States, which was an old Games Workshop IP, which I was a fan of as a kid. And I picked it up and we started doing it again. And I hadn't looked at it, or I'd looked at it a little bit, but I was rereading the rules when we started it. And I noticed they had a section about, so it's set in an alternative future, which doesn't seem that weirdly alternative now when I describe it. So an alternative future where they went down a different path, a celebrity became president, and when they had a celebrity as president, all of their systems ended up breaking down and they ended up as a post-apocalyptic hellscape. Which they wrote that in, I think they authored it in about 1987, and I think it came out in 88. So, you know, it has its parallels. So we worked on this game there, and as I say, we were lucky enough to work with a bunch of scientists and start to think about what would really these systems of normal things we take for granted, like healthcare, you know, start to happen to break down, try to build some of that into the narrative and writing the game. But the reason that came about in the first place was when I picked up went back through my copy of the rules to have a look over it as we started working on it. There's a section in it where the cause of it actually is climate change. They had said climate change debilitates the US until it ends up as this post-apocalyptic world. And they'd drawn these maps of a future America where sea level rise had written out. And this is in 1987. Out of interest, hands up here who were alive in 1987. A couple of people, a lot of them not. Like, that's how long, and again, the history of climate change as an issue, as we understood it might be an issue, I think goes back into the mid-1800s. So it's not new that we know about it. So I was like, it's in there, and I kind of wanted to talk about it, and so then we talked about it as part of the content of what we did. We talked about it, it was embedded in some of the writing of the game, it was built into how we tried to get across it. And the thing I was trying to get across it, and if you play the game, is a post-apocalyptic world is not a place you want to live. It's a fun place to have a fantasy in, to play a game in. It absolutely is not where you want to live. And it's full of these things that would happen with a societal breakdown that would just be the opposite of where you'd want to be. And in a way, that was how, to me, we were starting to, as well as, and there's some videos online where we talk about this stuff, as well as talking about how climate change would be, it's like, can we treat this as a warning? And increasingly, we're seeing fiction coming out now that does treat it as this way, that does try to say, look, this is a bleak future. Yes, it's a future that's interesting to explore as fiction, but is it a future that we actually want to live in? Is it a future that we want our future to be in? And I would hope the answer would be no, and therefore we have to think, how do we not get there? And the reason why we're doing it through games is because as a games developer, the natural way we think about things is through the medium of games. If I was a novelist, I might write a novel. If I was a poet, I'd write a poem about it. If I'm a songwriter, and I'm not, I'd write a song about it. I'm a games developer, been a games developer for a long time. I've wanted to be a games developer since I was little, lucky enough to be one. And therefore, the natural way I think about these things is through systems, through gaming systems, through play systems. So for me, embedding a topic that I'm interested and concerned about in a game is not jumping on a bandwagon, it's not tokenism, it's not doing it because it's the thing you should do. It's because, as a games designer, that is how I think about things, and therefore that's how I express it. And so, for me, games, and one of the interesting things that's happened over the last few years with games development, is we've gone from games being perceived from the outside of games as a frivolous child's thing. It's not a serious thing. And I've been involved in a lot of talks where I've been the person from the games industry, TV events and other media events where they're like, ooh, we have a person from games. You might have seen those things when you were a kid. Come in and tell us. And of course, now actually we're in the position where our industry is one of the dominant media industries. We're one of the biggest media industries. We are bigger than film and TV in lots of ways. And again, measuring the size of it is complicated. I won't get into that. But we're a sizable thing. And therefore, those people that create things within our industry, is it not natural then we would think about those things through that thing we're interested in? Why should a documentary about climate change be the only method you can talk about it? Why should it, if you want to express an interest or a concern about climate change, it has to be in an article in the Times, or it has to be an article in The Guardian? Why can't it be through a game? And my thing is, as a games developer, it should be. And as games has developed from this thing being seen as a play to a mainstream thing where people make games about every topic under the sun, which is great. And I love the fact that we cover so many topics. Unpacking, great example. Fantastic game about unpacking. Really enjoyable game, interesting topic. Could not get further from the perception of games from a few years ago that they were all driving games, fighting games, shooting games. And there's nothing wrong with those. We're making one of those genres of games at the moment. But the breadth of what we do. So therefore, if games can be about and cover this wide range of topics, and they do, then games should also be able to cover a wider range of emotions. So yes, play being the key thing, engagement, you wanting to do more of it. But games can also cover the other emotions. They can express our interest in things. They can express our worries about things, our fears, and we'll come to this one, our optimism for stuff. The fact that, yeah, things aren't great, but maybe they can be better. So we grabbed a few screenshots of games that are around there that touch on this. And I think what you'll see is once you start to think about climate and games, there's a bunch of ways it's gone about it there. And I think that, again, represent the sort of breadth of what games are covering. So if you recognize a few of the screenshots, and maybe you will, so the middle one is our Blood Red States. Terra Nil, I noticed actually is playable down there, so I'm going to go have a go on that. I spotted it on itch early on and thought that looks really cool. And had a bash on it. It's like, this is really good. And I was very pleased to see it picked up by a publisher. The one in the middle below that is Fate of the World. And Fate of the World was a game ostensibly where you run a kind of UN organization. It's a kind of strategy card game where you're trying to prevent climate change. I remember going to a talk by the developers of that. They said one of the interesting things that happened, and this to me is where play is an interesting dynamic within games, is they had a chunk of their players who'd start playing the game, and the first thing they'd do is destroy the world. It's like, your job is to save the world, let's just trash it. And then they did some research where they would ask people what they learned from playing the game. And interestingly, in trashing the world, people learned quite a lot about the systems. And that said to me, actually, games have a lot to offer, because it's not just the positive stuff, which is great, we have it, but also you can teach from the negative. So going back to my earlier point about actually, they can act as a warning to us. They can warn us about this enemy that's very hard to perceive. We can take this difficult thing that's hard to see as a threat, and we can use the game to crystallize it in some form that hopefully motivates people to say, I don't want that future, I want that action against it. And the other one there, Democracy 4. So Democracy 4, again, is this point, and these issues will interlock as I go through it. Democracy 4 is a game that simulates the democratic process. You see, it's on Steam now. It's worth playing. It's really good. It's the sequel to Democracy 3, unsurprisingly, which is also really good. But one of the things I like about the democracy games is there's Steam Workshop on there, and people have created a whole bunch of stuff modeling different scenarios. But again, what they start to talk of is the politics of climate change, which I think are really, really important. So games have already been starting to tackle this issue, and I think it's important that they continue to tackle the issue, because I think it's important as game developers we get to talk about what interests us, what we care about, what we're fascinated by, what we're scared of. And that's why I think there's a bunch of games there that are well worth checking out. So this is some stuff from a researcher who looks at the climate cost of games. And this is where we get into the difficult bit, which is, okay, I love games, I love playing games, I love making games, but there's a cost to it. And you can see here that there's a whole bunch of things that cost within games. We've got to make the raw materials for games. We're running the data centers. We've got to design and create the things themselves. We have events like this. And then ultimately, if you're buying a physical copy of the game, which people still do, we've got to ship that, we've got to get it. And ultimately, there's a carbon cost to all of that. Now, there's a carbon cost to everything. There's a carbon cost if we chose not to play games. The carbon cost to us being alive wouldn't go. But there's a carbon cost to doing it, and I think it's incumbent on, there's two angles. As people creating it, we can try to make it in ways that have less carbon cost, and as people consuming it, if we switch our choices to game systems that have a lower carbon cost, then we can be expressing it that way. And I know that UKI, which is one of the two trade bodies for our industry, has a bunch of initiatives they're trying to do on that. And I'll touch back on this a little bit in a minute, but the fact is, again, I'm aware it's there, and I'm aware that it's something as a game developer that we're interested in doing something about. So here's an example of something we do. So as I say, we're part of the Sumo Group. The Sumo Group is aiming to get carbon neutral as a thing. Now, wrapped up in there is a whole load of very complicated issues about how you become that. One of the areas that we're doing is straightforward, just using less energy. We can be more efficient in what we do. We can buy more efficient equipment when we replace equipment. We can use green energy supplies. And there's a bunch of stuff we are doing as part of that. And I'm pleased to see when we became part of the Sumo Group that their desire to become carbon neutral was not just saying it, they actually really cared about it at the topmost level and are acting on it. But the other thing that we can do is carbon offsets, which again are massively complicated, and I won't pretend that it's a straightforward, easy way. I know, and they are complicated because there are plenty of carbon offset things that are just guilt-free. I get to do this and not think about it, and the carbon offsets aren't really that useful, in some cases actually making things worse. But equally, there are natural processes that use carbon. And I'm from the point of view now that it's such a big issue that I'm less concerned with which thing you're doing to make it better than that you are doing things. I would rather people be doing things that maybe aren't the most efficient thing they could do than just doing nothing. Like, we're at the situation where it's such a big issue that really the question is not why isn't somebody else doing a different thing I think they should do, but what are you doing? And again, that's why we care about it as a value. What are we doing? So I can play a little bit of video that gives some example of one of the projects that we're funding here.
So it's nice to see some decent ones. They have to be peat.
So that's a project up north where they're restoring peatlands. And peatlands are a great example of something that actually traps carbon. Peat bogs, as the plants go into the bogs, they rot very slowly. The carbon in those actually gets trapped. So restoring peatlands actually is a great way of sinking some carbon. And to be honest, even if we got into a debate about exactly how much carbon they sink, the fact that they're restoring an area of wild land for nature to live in is a win-win. Even if we don't sink as much carbon as we'd like, the fact that there's more area for wildlife to live in, I see that as a win either way. But that's one of the things but that project, you need land, there's a lot of resources and money needs to go into all the people to do that, and the company gives those resources and money from the stuff we make. And it goes back to what I said, it's nice if it's more than just we're here to make money. It's nice if some of that money, some of that resource gets used to do these other things. And that's one of the things that happens with them. Oh, I jumped over there. Right, so I'll come into where I think this gets into difficult. I think there's different layers that we can do on this. And I will get to what I think the most important one of all these is as a player, like I say, you've got consumer choice. You spend your money where you want. If there's a company doing things that you don't agree with, don't give them your money. It is a big way of how you speak in a consumer society. I think it's a way, and I don't think we should see that as the only way we express ourselves, but it's there. It's a choice. You don't have to. If you play games that have climate narratives like ours, then I think there's a kind of, you learn a little bit more about it, and that's a good way. And then there's a bunch of games events that help push this. Now, all these are useful things, and they fold into the next thing that if you are prioritizing studios that do this stuff and care about this stuff, then what they should hopefully be doing is they're investing in renewable, using renewable energy where they can. They should be trying to make their business venture in a way. So as an example, we do travel to events as part of what we do, but we have to justify it. There's a process by which I have to justify my desire to travel somewhere, to fly somewhere to do it. And they monitor very heavily what everybody does. Not that they're saying don't do it. What they're saying is if you're going to fly to an event, we have to justify it. We can't just do it because you'd like to go there. It has to be a reason to do it. It's good business sense. It's good sense in terms of measuring the carbon output of the studio. Minimizing, and again, there's increasing technologies that help us to do it. But there are ways of writing code. There are ways of developing things so that they use less code in the way they're doing it, and we're interested in all those. And again, we can switch to the provider we use. But this is where I think we come to the biggest thing, which is as human beings. Because we can't, as a game studio, solve the climate crisis. As Auroch Digital, as a small studio. As part of a bigger thing, as part of Sumo, which is a studio that's across the group that's across the world, they can't solve the climate crisis. As an example, even if all of our consumer energy got piled into what we could do, I think the US military is something like the 4th biggest emitter of climate. Your consumer choices are not going to stop that. So ultimately, climate change comes down to a political question. It always has been. And again, as somebody who'd been interested in this topic, I thought about it. The first ostensive, overtly climate change protest I ever went on was 2001. So 21 years ago. I did not think this would still be a big issue 21 years later, and unfortunately I'm wrong. I remember having a debate with somebody who's a bit of a climate denier, and they're like, all this stuff they're firing off, and I'm happy to have a discussion if somebody doesn't believe in it. And I would love that to be the case. I would love it to be bullshit. I would love it to be wrong. I would love to not have any guilt about all this tech we use, and I'd love to be able to fly over to game developer conferences wherever I want and not worry about it at all. But the reality is different from what I'd like it to be. We can play that stuff out in the fantasy in our games, but the reality is different from it. So ultimately, climate change always has, always is, and will continue to be a political issue. The politics of it are what's going to solve it. When governments decide to take action, then it will change. Governments don't take action easily. Governments only take action when either they feel some existential crisis to do it, or when they feel their voters want them to do it. And then again, there's a whole complicated set of different political models we could discuss about what does and doesn't make change. But to me, all of these things that I do as a player, the things I do as a developer, the things I do as part of a bigger company, they all actually, I think the biggest thing they do is they create the environment in which us caring and doing something becomes not just the norm, but expected. It's what you should do as a human being, because why wouldn't you? It's the right thing to do. And then, again, you can get into the debate about which is the best action, which is the thing. And for me, I'm very big on this thing of it's fine if you do individual things. And it's great if people do those individual things, and I appreciate and respect people who do it. But if you do those individual things and you're not involved in the politics of it, I think you're only coming to the party half-dressed, if you like. Cutting down on your usage, not flying, and then not voting, you are missing the biggest tool in the box. It is a governmental, political question. The technology is there. Technology's been there for years. We were chatting on the train down about this. I remember campaigning around the first Gulf War about, wouldn't they put all these billions into renewable energy? Isn't it a terrible idea that we are, relying on energy from parts of the world that are really unstable? What if we did something about that now? And, oh yes, wouldn't it have been good 20 years ago if they had listened to that? But it was a political question then, and it's a political question now. So ultimately, all of these things we can do, yes, but they have to be part of that political thing. And that's why I feel, as game developers, the kind of final bit of that, of what we can and can't do, is work towards, with everybody else, to kind of mesh together to create this environment where that change feels inevitable. where that change feels like it's a thing that should happen. And I'll give an example, and I'm not the oldest person in the room, but I'm one of the older people in the room. I'll give an example of something where you can see that. So drink driving. Drink driving it's been illegal for a long time, but it used to be seen as one of these things that was no big deal. So what if you had a few pints and drove? And when I was younger, it happened all the time. And the police would just turn a blind eye to it, and it wasn't seen as a big thing. But of course, drink driving had a serious consequence. People died in accidents. People were maimed in accidents. But again, it wasn't, and it took the conscious effort of multiple sections of society to say, this is a bad thing that people are doing, and we should not do it. And so, yeah, there are laws to stop it, but the laws are not the thing that stops people doing drink driving most often. The thing that stops drink driving, the thing in my experience of life that has stopped countless episodes of somebody drink driving, I think, through my life, being in pubs and parties and things like that, is when somebody stood up to drive and grabbed their keys, somebody else would say, you're not going. You've had too much. You've had a drink. You've had something. No. And I've seen arguments. I've seen people helping each other out, people giving each other lifts. But ultimately, it became socially, that is just the thing you have to do, because the alternative is frightening. The alternative might be somebody's life lost, somebody wounded or maimed or anything like that. So as a society we exist, that same society as we evolved on the plains of Africa, say 200 to 450,000 years ago, into anatomically modern human beings, one of the things we developed then was the ability to act as a group, the ability to cohere as a group, the ability to become interdependent on each other. And that was our big survival thing. Other animals had developed, giraffes developed long necks, and tigers developed being really good hunters. We developed the ability to communicate. We developed the ability to interact with each other. And one of the areas and there's a whole book on this, which is worth reading, but one of the things that I think talked about, because they talk about the evolution of language, how did we evolve language and all these, the other thing we evolved was play. We evolved the ability to play, and play is this intrinsic part of human experience. And so I think those very things that make us human, the communication, the societal thing, the bonds with each other, all of those things that ultimately form these political things. And at the expression of that, the root, how we express it when we're younger, and I have to say as we get older as well, is play. And so I do think that what we do as game developers, what we do as players playing games, can be part of that thing. And to go back to that final point that I said about optimism, we're working on a couple of things at the moment that will talk about climate change. And we're not in a position to announce them yet. But they will talk about climate change. They will talk about it. But they won't talk about it as we did with Dark Future, in an apocalyptic, it's the end of the world way. They'll talk about it in a way that there's this problem here, and humanity came together, and sure, not everybody got on board with it, but enough of us did. And when enough of us got on board to do it, we managed to figure it out, and we got somewhere better. We got somewhere more improved from where we were. We got somewhere that was a better place. And that is, I think, one of the other things that we can do as creators, is say, yes, we can make games that have post-apocalyptic horror scenarios, and they are warnings, but we can also make games that show us that maybe there's a better way of doing it. Thank you.
Dr. Rawlings. We've got time for some questions before the end, so does anyone have any questions? Start off, show of hands. Yeah, so we should start lining up at the microphone, and whilst we wait for that to happen, Dr. Rawlings, one question from me quickly before we get started. Bit of a toughie. So, given how serious the climate situation does seem to be getting, would you recommend someone not actually go into game development to avoid risking having an overly big impact in terms of their carbon footprint?
It goes to me to the point that I said that, XR, the kind of campaign group, one of the things that they do that I agree with is they try to get away from that individual guilt thing. It's, if you've flown, if you've got this car, if you've driven, if you've made this choice, don't overly wrap yourself up in that. And I would agree, yes, I think we need to be conscious of what we do. As I say, I think it's good business sense not to go to events. If you're running a game development studio, not to go to events you don't need to because they're expensive. It's also good climate sense to use, less carbon. But don't overly wrap yourself up in that, because that isn't going to do it. You can spend ages thinking about your own personal consumption. And we saw this during the pandemic when almost nobody was traveling. The carbon footprint of the world went down a little bit, but not that much. It is not the solution is individual action, unless that individual action is tied to political action.
There was a question over there as well.
Thanks very much for that talk. That was fascinating. One thing that, I mean, not to sort of jump on your point about individual action, because I appreciate it needs to be connected to political action, but I made a lifestyle change relatively recently, inspired for environmental reasons, and one of the things that convinced me to go vegan was an in-flight magazine that I read that gave a really interesting infographic that put the impact of all of that into particular context. So I appreciate this might be almost impossible to answer, but is there any way that you can quantify or illustrate the impact of consumer action, like, say, for instance, downloading a game? Like, what, you know, if you take $1 billion bills and stack them, you know, one on top of the other, it'll lead to the moon, and that, like, puts in context how much money a billionaire has, like billionaire wealth. Is there anything that you could say to illustrate that?
Yeah, see, I think, you know, reducing your meat, you know, is definitely a way you can have an impact, and of personal things you can do that do have an impact. That's one of the more notable ones. But again, I personally think that, again, without tied to the other side of it. But you raise a good point, which again, I think is that desire for us to have a really simple way of understanding this. And to me, one of these things with climate is it's horrendously complicated. So a good example would be, you know, planes emit a certain amount of CO2, but planes emit that CO2 in the upper atmosphere. So a plane emitting CO2 is actually much more damaging than emitting CO2 on a ground level, because it has a different impact depending on where in the atmosphere it is. So the impact on the emissions and what we choose to do. So a good example would be if you're going to use, you know, say, soya products. Well, the soya is going to be less than the beef, but where's the soya come from? So you then have to get into understanding the chain that brought the soya to there, the processing and everything like that. And again, I think you can tie yourself in knots with it. I think to me, the best thing that you can do is go back to the thing where you're thinking about your own life and making what you consider to be positive changes. And if you've made a choice to be vegan, I absolutely wouldn't criticize that. I absolutely respect that. If somebody else has made a choice not to fly, if somebody else has made a choice to reduce this thing, I absolutely respect those choices. And what I wouldn't do then is indulge in criticizing and saying, yeah, but, you know, if you did this thing, it's like, well, actually, I'm much more interested in what I'm doing, you know. So, you know, run through the things I donate money to various political causes, so campaign groups and things like that. I sustain a few of them on direct debits monthly. I got involved in the last election on campaigning on stuff, and one of my big motivations on that was climate. I will get involved in whichever one's next. I don't know who I'm going to go with, I'll say. Depends on who's got, I think, the best policies and the best chance of getting something to win. Because for me, it's not the individual party that I care about. It's the party that I think is most going to win to achieve that aim. So to me, those are the things. It's interesting to me that when people ask about what the choice we're doing, we never ask, who are you voting for? We never ask, are you donating money to a political campaign? We don't ask those things. We ask about the individual consumer choices. And our consumer lives are one thing, but for me, the political life is the bit where you can actually have the outsized impact. So I think it's helpful for us to get that dialogue going, for definite.
Was there any more questions? Yep.
Hi, thank you for the speech. It was very informative. So one question I have as an up-and-coming game developer, especially for certain roles that some of us are going into, there's not a lot of options for which developers we can actually find jobs in. And so some of us going into some of these companies, they don't have as much interest in looking into their carbon footprints and considering climate change. So what would be your advice for those lower-level, entry-level developers going to the industry, but also not wanting to contribute to this crisis, as well as maybe possibly changing their company for the better?
So it's a good question, and thank you for it. One of the things you can have an impact, and this actually will be consumer end as well as within a company. Lots of companies will create forums whereby they will ask staff what issues they're concerned about, and most people don't bother responding ever. The plus of that means the few people who do bother responding will have an outsized impact. So when you're working for a company and they do satisfaction surveys, and I fill those things in, I always bring up the issue of climate. And if the company's doing the right thing, I'll say, I'm glad you're doing this, and underline it. If they're not, I'm saying, it would be great if we could do something. The other thing that what you'll find at companies then is, and especially as we're working in much more distributed ways now, is there's lots of ways of people getting together in distributed ways, there's social channels and things like that. And again, I think it's just be authentic. If you care about this issue, and you just talk about it. When you're in a Slack chat with somebody, with a team, and it's appropriate, and you're having a discussion, bring the thing up. If it's a game you're making, there's a topic there, bring it up. And I think if you bring it up unapologetically, but at the right point, it's not like it's a morning meeting and somebody's going through the schedule for the day and you're like, hang on, can we all stop and think about the climate crisis? Obviously, that's not the right time. But if there's a thing where, we're all getting together and talk about what ideas might we like to, put in the next title we're doing, bring those things up. And I think you'll be surprised how much it snowballs. One of the things, and this applies to any social issue, is the more visibility that issue has, the more people talk about it, the more other people will then step up and say, well, actually, I care about that too. And that's one of the things that actually positively pleased with it. Sumo is when we became part of them, we had this as part of Auroch. So I was getting ready for the conversation about going, okay, we do this thing here. We want to carry on doing it, firstly, and it would be nice if we shared what we're doing with others. And then I was really pleasantly surprised to find that actually there was loads of people at the company that cared about it. And one of the things that Sumo are doing now is they've created this idea of climate champions. So within the group, people can become a climate champion. They'll put some of your work time, a couple of days a month, into doing stuff around that and put a budget in that. So we can start to think about individual actions that studios can do and take. But again, the visibility is the big part of that.
There was one more. Do you want to do your last question, and then that'll be it for the panel? Thank you.
Hi, thanks for the talk. I was just going to ask, because you actually just brought it up just a few minutes ago, because Sumo, because you also mentioned Sumo is like an international group now. Does that mean they have, obviously they're different countries, you're going to have different cultural ideas on climate change, and you also have to think about Sumo's recent acquisition by Tencent last year. So that's also China's look at climate change. Has that been an issue that pretty much every studio within Sumo has had to kind of fight for?
No, Sumo is its own entity. And it does its own thing, and that's not changed. If anything, it's accelerated. But I think you raise a good point of how different nations engage with it. And this, to me, would be an interesting example. Now, when I talk about this stuff, what I won't do is say any country is great per se, because lots of criticisms you would level against. But a good example would be 10 years ago, and like I say, I've been involved in the climate change issue. China did not consider climate to be an issue it cared about, and it didn't do anything. And for its own reasons, and there's some good articles written about why they did a U-turn on this. They have gone to the point now of saying, we care about this issue and we're going to do stuff about it. And the amount of new wind and solar coming online and the acceleration of wind and solar, and therefore the dropping of cost on wind and solar, is in large part due to big countries like China, and they're not the only one, embracing that technology and driving it forward. And to me, there's an exemplar point of how when a country decides politically it wants to do something about it, stuff does happen, and happens at a rate way beyond anything that can happen individually or within an individual company.
Thank you.
That's all we have time for today, so thank you for all the questions, and thank you once again to Dr. Tomas Rawlings. It was a really good talk. We have another panel coming up at 4 o'clock, Gaming Bible, the Future of Games Media, but if we could just have one final round of applause for Tomas Rawlings. Thank you.